It seems that every month a new amp or DAC is released and people are gushing about its performance. Sometimes I wonder how many people actually buy the stuff they hype. Is it possible that a bunch of trolls take demonic pleasure from watching others get worked up and waste money on products? Oh, you bet. Topping recently released their new amp and DAC stack. Their DAC is the E30 and the amplifier is the L30. I already reviewed the E30 and found that it is indeed a good DAC, a little overpriced, and does not do anything fundamentally different from the SMSL Sanskrit Mark II. Now, we turn to the L30. This is a $140 headphone amplifier with RCA output for your speakers. Apos Audio sent me the L30 to review and return. I recently began a partnership with them. They intend to send me gear to review from time to time, and in return I provide purchase links to their website. If you choose to buy from the Apos link, I get a small kickback. I've purchased from Apos Audio before and found their customer service was good, their shipping speed was quick, and communication excellent. Now, on to the L30. The way I see it, the L30 has two big features and a few unimportant ones. The big features are the NFCA modules. Topping calls this the Nested Feedback Composite Amplifier and says it is a trickle-down technology from their flagship A90 amplifier. According to Topping, their technology allows the amp to drive low-impedance headphones with ease. The second big feature is the raw power output. The L30 has 3.6 watts at 16 ohms, 2.3 watts at 32 ohms, and 280 milliwatts at 600 ohms. The less relevant features are the purported 141 decibel dynamic range, ultra-low noise, and minuscule THD numbers. The L30's output impedance is 0.1 ohms, which is par for the course in modern amplifiers as far as headphone outputs go. If you're concerned about damping factor, especially for low impedance headphones and IEMs, then the L30's output impedance should not be an issue. All these numbers by themselves might look impressive, but we should put them in context. The Schiit Magni Heresy has 2.8 watts into 16 ohms, 2.4 watts into 32 ohms, and 215 milliwatts into 600 ohms. Its output impedance is less than 0.25 ohms. The FX Audio DAC X6 has 1 watt into 16 ohms, 910 milliwatts into 32 ohms, and 90 milliwatts into 600 ohms. I could not find any output impedance specifications for the X6. The Heresy is $100, the X6 is about $60. I had to return the E30 to Apos Audio, so I cannot provide a stack review. However, during the E30 review, I compared it to the SMSL Sanskrit Mark II, which has the exact same DAC as the E30. I noted that these products sound virtually identical. Consequently, for this test, I'm going to use the SMSL Sanskrit Mark II. I plugged the Sanskrit into an RCA switch. I plugged both the L30 and the Heresy into that switch so that both amps receive the same signal from the Sanskrit. As a comparison, I also plugged the X6 and used it as a separate amp DAC to determine if I could hear any differences from the L30 and Heresy. Just consider the X6 as a control group. I played music using Amazon Music HD. I tried to volume match to the best of my ability. I used the Avantone Planar, the most neutral headphone I have ever heard. The differences between the Heresy and L30 are very minor, but perceptible if you listen closely enough. The L30 seems to be just slightly more neutral than the Heresy, which tended to exhibit a slight sub-bass emphasis. That sub-bass and mid-bass combined to provide slightly greater bass presence than on the L30. In bassy songs like Conquer by Overwork, the mid-bass impact seemed marginally harder on the Heresy. This might have been due to improper volume matching, which is why I kept testing back and forth. I did in fact hear slightly greater mid-bass impact with the drums in this song when plugged into the Heresy. The decay seemed to be fractionally longer as well. The Avantone Planar is a very neutral headphone, and its sub-bass is a little rolled off. Consequently, it is fairly easy to determine if an amplifier adds sub-bass presence when I use hip-hop songs. On the L30, the Planar sounded as it does with any other neutral source. The sub-bass was present and underrepresented. It needed a few decibel boost, which is entirely in line with the Planar's sound signature. On the Heresy, the sub-bass rumble was marginally stronger and slightly longer. The Heresy did not cure the Planar's underperforming sub-bass, but it was a step above from the L30, so to speak. The X6 has a more clinical, more analytical DAC-amp combination. Consequently, I heard slightly more clarity, marginally better instrument separation on the X6 than I did on the other two amplifiers. The X6 was closer to the L30's bass presentation than it was to the Heresy's presentation. I would even go so far as to say that the X6 rendered sub-bass ever so slightly less audible than the L30. Mid-bass impact on the X6 seemed about the same as that of the L30 and just slightly less impactful than the Heresy. Bass clarity was more obvious on the X6 than on the other two amplifiers. I would not call it a night and day difference, but it was noticeable. Overall, the bass response for the L30 appears to be quite neutral. There is no harshness or distortion. Indeed, I will emphasize that neither of these three products exhibited harshness or distortion or noise. The differences between these amplifiers were sometimes present and sometimes very difficult to perceive. We are not talking about huge leaps and bounds here. I will admit that the X6 does have a notably more analytical, clearer sound signature, but the differences between the Heresy and L30 are far less significant. There are some minor differences in the mid-frequency. The Avantone planar does not accentuate sibilance or grain. It keeps things as neutral as possible. I am intimately familiar with some of my test tracks and know which ones contain recorded sibilance and grain. One of those tracks is Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland. Switching back and forth between the L30 and Heresy, it was immediately apparent that the L30 pushed the sibilance a few decibels. It was not harsh or peaky, but noticeable. The S sounds in her singing were slightly sharper and stood out more so than they did on the Heresy. In Want You Back by Haim, I conducted a similar examination. I found that the sibilance was very close between the L30 and Heresy and appeared to be accurate. I went back to Orla Gartland's song to verify, and again it was obvious that the L30 slightly accentuated her sibilance. Guitars, pianos, drums, vocals all seem to have accurate timbre on the L30. Indeed, there is no apparent difference between the L30 and Heresy in this regard. What is marginally different is the decay of some instruments, like guitars. The Heresy's decay was slightly longer than what I heard on the L30. Again, this could be attributed to improper volume matching or merely an error on my part. Nevertheless, even though I listened over and over again, I always sensed guitars had marginally, and I do mean marginally, longer decay. When I switched to the X6, I noticed the same things that I noticed when testing the bass response. The X6 has a clearer presentation, more analytical. But with this comes an elevation of grain and sibilance, both of which were above what the L30 presented. Vocals sounded a little thinner on the X6 than on the L30 and Heresy. By this, I mean that the vocals seemed to have slightly faster decay and more separation from other mid-centric instruments. Vocals, guitars, drums, pianos all had accurate timbre, but did not have the same amount of presence as the other two amplifiers. Attribute this to the more clinical DAC in the X6. The differences between the L30 and Heresy were not night and day. On some occasions, the Heresy appeared to have fuller, more forward mids, and on other times, it and the L30 seemed identical. I found that the treble response between the L30 and Heresy was practically indistinguishable. All instruments were presented with accurate timbre. Decay was ever so slightly longer on the Heresy in some tracks. More often than not, the presentation was hard to separate between the L30 and the Heresy. Brass and horns exhibited their characteristic energy and cut-through orchestral mixes. Separation of instruments was the same between the L30 and Heresy, that is, it was about average. I could hear group sets, but not individual instruments. Pianos sounded true and accurate. There was no distortion or muddying. The L30 and Heresy were basically identical in this regard. Saxophone sounded accurate as well, without being peaky or harsh. On the X6, all my test tracks had a more clinical approach. Although this did not bring more detail, it did bring a bit more harshness from some instruments. Brass and horns had marginally more energy. Saxophone sounded slightly overemphasized. Though I would not say that the X6 became difficult to listen to, I would emphasize that its presentation was markedly different from the L30 and Heresy. The Avantone planar is about average in detail retrieval. It provides a natural amount of detail in a natural fashion. In other words, I think you hear the amount and type of detail on the planar that you would hear with your own ears at a live concert. The L30 and Heresy did not alter this perception. I will underscore that the Heresy sometimes seemed to very slightly veil some details that were ever so marginally clearer on the L30. For example, the creaking of wood was a little clearer on the L30, but the reverberation of bass was a bit more obvious on the Heresy. On the X6, I did not hear more details, but I heard them differently. They were marginally clearer than they were on the L30 and Heresy. Some of those details had different timbre as well. For example, the creaking of wood and shifting of the cello was slightly more distant on the X6. It was more apparent on the Heresy and the L30. The overall impression I have is that the L30 and Heresy are essentially the same when delivering details. They are so close to each other in sound signature that the minor alterations here and there are not consistent. What is consistent is the X6's ability to provide a more analytical tilt to everything: bass, mids, treble, and detail. I did not hear more detail or more accurate detail from the X6. I just heard the same amount of details a little bit clearer. I have said this before, and I will say it again. There is no evidence that amps and DACs affect soundstage. Soundstage is a combination of the original recording methodology and your speakers or headphones. Lots of people throw the word soundstage on the table when discussing amps and DACs, and I have a strong suspicion they actually mean something else. If a DAC and amplifier are tuned to be warm, then you might perceive a more intimate sound signature. Switch to a more neutral or analytical source, and you might hear more clarity, and mistakenly believe that the effect was from an alteration of soundstage. Furthermore, a key factor in all of this is making sure your headphones get sufficient power or current. Underpowered headphones obviously will have a different sound signature than those powered properly. I can say that the L30, Heresy, and X6 provided sufficient power for the Aventone Planar. There was no difference whatsoever in soundstage among these amplifiers. I think it's safe to say that the L30 is neutral. I might even say that it is slightly more neutral than the Heresy. I think Schiit makes decent products, but I usually hear grain in their amplifiers. The Heresy was the first Schiit amp that did not exhibit such grain. Consequently, I think it is the smoothest amplifier I have heard from Schiit. The Heresy has a slightly warm sound signature. It's not V-shaped and it is barely U-shaped. The slight bass emphasis and longer decay of some instruments gives the impression that the amp is a little bit more intimate. Compared to the L30, the Heresy is not that dissimilar. I will admit that I hear differences, but I would not call them significant. I assume your particular headphones will result in a slightly different experience from what I had. In other words, super sensitive headphones might reveal bigger differences to you, but that's just all speculation. I used the DAC X6 as a control group because I wanted to make sure I could keep hearing differences among the units. I know that the X6 has a more clinical approach. Think of it as a palate cleanser for the ears, so basically an ear canal cleanser. Anyway, when I went to the X6 and then back to the L30 and Heresy, I confirmed that there are slight differences between the L30 and Heresy, and both are far closer to each other than either is to the X6. In other words, you could not confuse the sound of the X6 with the sound of the L30 or Heresy, but you might just confuse the L30 for the Heresy if all parameters were equal. I am quite happy to say that the L30 is neutral. There's no harshness, no distortion, no channel imbalance, no audible noise. The amplifier does its job and does it well. When companies throw power output numbers on the table, you expect those values to actually matter. In the case of the L30, on paper, it is more powerful than the Heresy and the X6. In fact, it is probably the most powerful amplifier in its price category. The vast majority of headphones do not need this type of power output, but some do. From my arsenal of headphones, I pulled out the Modhaus Argon, Beyerdynamic T1 2nd generation, and the 600 ohm variant of the DT880. I put the Heresy and L30 on high gain. The Argon are notoriously difficult to drive. The T1 and 880 are 600 ohm headphones, and the latter requires high output impedance for optimum performance. All three amplifiers technically drove all three of these headphones. Of course, only the T1 seemed to perform near its peak performance in clarity and vocal presence and smoothness. The Argon did work, but the thumping, rumbling, massive bass they are known for was not actually present on the X6. On the other hand, the Argon did perform fairly well, providing most of its character on both the Heresy and L30, and I was able to volume match on those amplifiers. The DT880 never sounded its best on any of these amplifiers. On the Heresy and the L30, the 880 became louder than strictly safe. However, the headphone's precise, clear, impactful bass was not present on any of these amplifiers. It was blunted, a bit muddy, and overall the bass sounded a little bloated. The mids were also slightly recessed. I think there are a couple of takeaways. If you have a high impedance headphone, then all three amplifiers will likely drive them quite easily. If you have very hard to drive headphones like the Argon or Aria, then you might not be happy with the performance. If you purchase something like the T1, then you'll probably experience the headphones close to their peak. And when it comes to the 600 ohm variant of the 880, my position remains the same as before. Based upon my direct conversations with Beyerdynamic, my repeated tests, and reviewing articles on the subject, I strongly believe that the 880 requires high output impedance, not insane levels of power. Consequently, I think you will experience less than optimum performance for the 880 when you use any of these amplifiers. When I look at the L30, I have to think about the alternatives. The Heresy or Magni 3 are cheaper, about the same size, and provide comparable power output. So what does the L30 do better or differently that justifies its price tag? In my opinion, I think the differences are so minor that it is difficult to explain why anyone should spend the extra $40 on the L30. Yes, the L30 has 3 gain options. Their -9 decibel downward departure is for sensitive IEMs and headphones, and it works fine, but I think it's kind of a gimmick. I find it hard to believe that people are craving desktop amplifiers for their IEMs, especially sensitive IEMs. I'm sure there are some people who want that, but I doubt it is the majority. The jibber-jabber about NFCA modules and atomic level THD and noise is frankly pointless. You cannot hear it, therefore it is totally irrelevant. Topping clearly wants to flaunt numbers that have no practical application. The overwhelming power output of the L30 might be relevant to some people and unmitigated hype for others. I simply do not see any rational basis for 3.5 watts for 16 ohm headphones or IEMs. There is no headphone that I know of on the market that needs this much power. The whole purpose of low impedance headphones is to make them easier to use with all types of devices. So shoehorning ridiculous levels of power into an amplifier might look like a good idea, but it turns out to be a dangerous one. When you start comparing the L30's power output to the Heresy, you notice that the two amplifiers really are not that far apart. Yes, the L30 is still the more powerful amplifier, but just barely. The build of the L30 is just fine. It's sturdy, and its switches seem robust. The amp is simple to operate. It has a brick of a power adapter, and the unit does get hot, but that's just the nature of amplifiers. I will emphasize that the volume knob on the L30 is smoother than on the Heresy. I have found that shit products all have a stiff, sometimes grindy volume knob, but the L30's is easy to move and fairly precise. So, there are only 2 real issues to consider besides the price, at least in my opinion. First, do you actually need 3.5 watts at 16 ohms or the marginally higher power output at 600 ohms? Second, do you want slightly more neutral sound? If the answer is yes to either question, then the L30 is a fine option. It does nothing wrong and is a very competent amplifier. Should someone sell their Heresy or Magni 3 for the L30? No, I don't think so. The minor differences in sound signature are not worth the cost, in my opinion. Should someone rush out to buy the L30 over the Heresy or Magni 3 if they have neither of these amplifiers? Well, unless your answer is yes to one of those 2 questions I posed a few moments ago, then I do not see why you need to spend the additional $40. I am happy to see that there is a good, effective product out of the L30, and it's fairly reasonably priced. The L30, along with its companion DAC, the E30, do a good job of delivering neutral performance for a decent price. However, my position is that you should not get led astray by unmitigated hype. This amplifier is a good neutral amp. However, If you are forced to choose between this and the Heresy or the Magni 3, and it comes down to price, then I don't think you would be making any mistake by choosing the cheaper shit product, should you choose to do that.